No, we have.
Alright, today we're going to start talking about properties of parallelograms, and then we're going to use them to solve some problems. So, as Sebastian already told us, the definition of a parallelogram is a quadrilateral with both pairs of opposite sides parallel. Right? So that's our definition, that's our first property. Okay? We will use that over the next few sections here. Actually, over the next 4 sections, we're going to be talking about different types of parallelograms. So, opposite sides are parallel. We also know that in a parallelogram, opposite sides are congruent. Right? They have the same length. So, for example, if I know that PQ is 10, bless you, then I also know that SR is 10. Okay? If PS is 7, then I know QR is 7. Opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent. The next property is that opposite angles are also congruent. Okay, so, for example, if we know that angle S is 60 degrees, then angle Q is also 60 degrees. Okay? Opposite angles have to be exactly the same. Next one is that consecutive angles are supplementary. A couple of words in there to unpack. What does consecutive mean?
Right after.
Right after or right next to. We're talking about a picture. So we're saying angles that are right next to each other are supplementary. What is supplementary?
Less? Greater than 180? 1 degrees. Is it equal to 90 degrees?
Not 90. 180. Yeah, they equal 180 together. They add to 180. Right? So make a note of that. Supplementary means add to 180. Okay, remember the little trick we talked about to remember the difference between complementary and supplementary. And if somebody gives you a compliment, oh, stop it. 90 degrees. Okay? So then supplementary is the other one. Supplementary means add to 180. So we're saying in this parallelogram, angles that are right next to each other add to 180. So if we know that angle S is 60, then angle R would be 180 minus 60. Angle R would have to be 120.
Mr. Fach, can I stop real quick? I think I see a lot of phones out. So I think everyone needs to put their phones away and pay attention quietly. I'm sorry. I'm trying to remember this from last year and I'm struggling. So
Yeah, how about tomorrow we start putting back up here?
yeah.
Right? It's just at the beginning of class. Come up here, put your phone in the holder, and that's how we'll take attendance. So if it's not up there, you're absent. Right? So angles that are consecutive, meaning right next to each other, have to add to 180. So angles S and R are next to each other. They add to 180. Angles R and Q are next to each other. They add to 180. That also means that P would be 120 degrees. Okay, so 4 properties so far. Opposite sides are parallel. Opposite sides are congruent. Then opposite angles are congruent. And consecutive angles are supplementary. The last one on the front here, we'll kind of get more into when we talk about rectangles later. But it just says if a parallelogram has one right angle, then all 4 are right angles. Right? Well, that kind of comes from the last 2 properties. Right? If one of these angles is 90 degrees, well, the opposite angle would have to be 90 because opposite angles are the same. Then consecutive angles are supplementary. So if this one's 90, this one would be 180 minus 90, which is also 90. Right? So this last property just kind of comes from these 2, saying that opposite angles are congruent and consecutive angles are supplementary. Right? So we're going to take those properties now and try to solve some problems. So let's first look at this example here. We've got parallelogram ABCD. One thing I should mention as we start looking at figures that are named like this, this tells us the order that the vertices are placed around the figure. Okay, so if I start here with A, I go in order. So A, B, C, D. It's not A, B, C, D. They go in order around the perimeter of the figure. A, B, C, D. Okay, that will actually be important when we get into doing stuff with the coordinates of parallelograms here in a little bit. But for now, our purposes are to solve for both A and B. Okay, so if we start looking at the variable of A, that's given as the side length of segment AB. What I know in a parallelogram is that opposite sides are congruent. They have the same length. So I know that AB and BC will be the same. So I can set 2A equal to 34 here. Well, just divide by 2. We get that A is equal to 17. And we know that because opposite sides are congruent. Well, then if I look at my variable of B, that's part of angle A, I'm given angle C then. Another property I know is that opposite angles are congruent. So here I can say 8B equals 112. Divide both sides by 8. And what does that get us? 14. Right, so the three big properties we're going to be using here are opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, and consecutive angles are supplementary. Right, so there's a few problems down here in the exercises where we'll have to use the idea that angles that are right next to each other add to 180. Right, but we'll also use opposite sides are equal and opposite angles are equal. Questions? Other questions? Okay, so let's take a couple of minutes then and see what we can do with these exercises down here using those properties. It'll take 10 minutes or so. See what you guys can do with these 6 problems.
Yes.
All right, here are the answers for each of our variables. Okay, take a look up here. See how you did. Okay, so from what I'm hearing, 4 and 5 may have been a little bit tricky. Alright, so let's take a look at those ones here. Okay, for number 4, we don't have any numerical values, just some variables in here. So I want to look at the 2 angles that have the same variable. Okay, the bottom 2 here, we have 6x and 12x. Those 2 angles are consecutive. They're right next to each other. So we know that consecutive angles are supplementary, or they add to 180. So this would be my setup to start, right? Adding these 2 together and setting them equal to 180. So we would get 18x equals 180, divide by 18, and we get x equals 10. Then to solve for y, I'm going to need to take that answer of 10 and plug it back in. Right? So 12 times 10 would be 120 degrees. And we could do 6 times 10 as well and get that this one would be 60. Okay, so once I have that information, then I can say, well, these are opposite angles, so they'll be equal to each other. So we can say 3y equals 120. Divide both sides by 3, and we'll get y equals 40. For number 5, then, the easiest way, I think, to think about this is to think about this entire angle here. Okay, just kind of pretend that this line isn't even here. I mean, we could even redraw this and say this angle is 2y, this one's 5x, and then this whole thing, we would just add 60 and 55 together to get that this angle is 115. So now we can say, well, these two angles, the 115 and the 5x, are right next to each other. They're consecutive, so they would add to 180. 5x plus 115 equals 180. Subtract the 115 over. Divide by 5. And we get x equals 13. Then we can do the same thing for y. These angles are consecutive. So I could say 2y plus 115 equals 180. Again, subtract the 115 over. We get 2y equals 65. Divide by 2. We end up with 32.5. Okay, so on these problems, we're using 3 of the properties that we looked at. Right? Opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, and consecutive angles are supplementary. Okay. Other questions on this? All right. I think that's about all we have time for today. So, try a couple of these for homework. Page 437, 438, numbers 9 through 16.